And so we're going to make the transition now to the next session, session 7, where we are going to look at the next series of 7. Just as we saw 7 churches and 7 seals and 7 trumpets, we now are seeing another revelation of 7, and this time it's 7 bowls of judgment. And so with that, we'll start this session of 7 angels pour out 7 bowls. And so as we look through this section, we'll see it's organized in some ways like what we saw previously with regard to the seals and with the trumpets. There is an introduction section that kind of sets it up, and then we see a grouping of the first 4 bowls, and they'll be related. There'll be a 5th bowl that will kind of segregate out something. There's a 6th bowl that gets a little more intense, and we don't really have an interlude, as it were, as in the others, but we have an interlude embedded into the 6th bowl. I think we'll see that. And then the 7th bowl is treated as that final kind of triumphant or climactic statement of this. So let's look through those. And we'll look first at the introduction. John says, now the vision shifts again. He says, I saw in heaven another great and marvelous sign. 7 angels with 7 last plagues. Last because with them God's wrath is completed. We're turning a corner here. Remember when we were with the trumpets, there were a third. There was some sort of, it seems like immediate kind of place here. But we're definitely turning a page here to think about the last plagues. Now, whenever you think of plagues, obviously you think about the plagues sent upon Egypt. And what we're going to see as these bowls unfold is that we're definitely reliving the days of Egypt here and the plagues that are there. And John is seeing a whole different revelation of them, a fulfillment of them, and we're seeing those plagues as a sign of what's to come. So let's continue to walk through that, and we'll see these images make themselves known. And I saw what looked like a sea of glass glowing with fire and standing beside the sea. Those who had been victorious over the beast and its image and over the number of its name. They held harps given them by God and sang the song of God's servants Moses and of the Lamb. Remember, back in chapter 4, we saw this throne room, which we said was really a combination of the throne room and the temple. It was the place of God's presence from which he reigned. And we saw there this great picture of this great sea of glass. And we thought perhaps it reminded us a little bit of that huge laver of water that was placed in the front of the temple, reminding everyone who came into those temple grounds that you must be clean. You must be clean, the priests must be clean, the Levites must be clean, the utensils must be clean, the sacrifices must be clean. It's a reminder of the need for washing to enter into the presence of God. And so that's where we first saw this image of this sea. But it seems to me that there's another texture taken on here, that this sea has another dimension to it, and it takes us back to the Red Sea. That sea in which God made this path of dry land for his people to walk through that sea. And on the other side of the sea, when they were victorious and they looked back and they saw the Egyptians go into that sea, they saw God's judgment upon that army. And so there's a sense in which I think John is seeing a vision that recalls this image, thinking about his future and the future of the people of God, that someday we too will be on the other side of that sea, looking back on the judgment that God is pouring out. And so you do have a little bit of that image. And the reason I suggest this is because that reference there at the end, that God gave them this song. Now, we've already seen the 144,000 singing their song, and now we see it wrapped in this other context, as I suggested before, that Moses sang this song of victory. When he saw the destruction and the judgment of God upon the evil persecutors of his people, Moses sang this song of victory. And so he's showing John that someday you will be in that place as well. And so with that in mind, then, he can see that promise of God fulfilled. Look at this text as the story continues. It says, "After this I looked, and I saw in heaven the temple, that is the tabernacle of the covenant of the law, and it was opened. And out of the temple came 7 angels with 7 plagues. They were dressed in clean, shining linen, and wore golden sashes around their chests." So now as they stood on the other side of the sea, then God opens heaven, the same place that the seals were opened, where God's revelation was going to be poured out upon the people of God. Now these angels are coming out, and they're dressed like priests. They're dressed to do the image of God. Remember this image of a temple, this tabernacle. The idea of the covenant of the law, the text that was put there, the tabernacle, covenant of the law, it's talking about that ark of the presence of God in which were placed these law tablets. And the whole idea of those law tablets were this was God's will. But here's the thing. Remember that story that Moses told Joshua, and that Joshua later repeated when he got into the land, that when they got there, they were supposed to stand on opposite side of this mountain. And on one side, they would declare the blessings. On the other side, they would declare the curses. And the image we have here now is it's time for the curses. All those things that God said would happen if you don't follow his will, if you don't follow his ways, we're there. This is now the complete fulfillment of that. We've talked about the blessing coming into among the people of God, but see now, what about the curses? God was not kidding when he said, if we don't follow his ways, this is how it will end. If we don't do what he says, this is how it ends. He designed us. He knows how it's supposed to work. We don't follow his rules, curses will come. And so the image we have here is now it's time for the curses to be held out. And these angels who now are the priests of God, the ones who do God's work, they now become these agents of God to minister law and justice at the end of time. And so now we watch as those ministers of justice come out. Then one of the 4 living creatures gave to the 7 angels 7 golden bowls filled with wrath of God, who live forever and ever. And the temple was filled with smoke from the glory of God and from his power. And no one could enter the temple until the 7 plagues of the 7 angels were completed. The idea here is an image of fire. These bowls, you remember that when the offering was given, the ashes were compiled and collected in these urns. And the idea here is that these ashes from the burning sacrifice, the burning from the altar, the judgment that was pronounced upon those victims on the altar, they produced these fires of judgment. And the idea here is that these fires now, these angels are going to take and dump this burning coals onto the earth. These ashes of judgment upon evil. It's that kind of fire. That's really the image we have here. And it's going to take place in this through these 7 angels. Then I heard a loud voice from the temple saying to the 7 angels, "Go pour out the 7 bowls of God's wrath on the earth." And so we have this unleashing, and what we're going to see is those bowls of wrath, they're going to look a lot like the plagues that we already saw in Egypt, but with a twist, a rather severe twist. And so now the pouring out of those bowls begin. On the next slide here, if you have your handout, you'll see that all we've done here is compare the trumpets with the bowls. We've listed them together. And you see they're very much in correspondence with one another, with an important difference. The first trumpet, for example, deals with hell, fire, blood, fall on the earth. And the first bowl is poured out on the earth. The next one, we have this mountains cast the sea, turn the sea into blood. Now, the second bowl is also for the sea. And so you see that there is a tie-in between the trumpets and the bowls, but there's an important distinction. Whereas the trumpets, you constantly heard about a third, a third, a third. Now, as we turn to the bowls, it's complete, it's total. We've turned some important corner, and we'll talk about in a moment. But there's a reason why the parallels are there and the distinctions are there. So let's just keep that in mind. So let's look then at these 7 bowls. The first angel went and poured out his bowl on the land, and ugly, festering sores broke out on the people who had the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. So if you remember the plagues of Egypt back in the day, one of them was this plague of boils upon the skin. And just to kind of put the context here, you remember the context of those plagues. The idea God is saying to these oppressors of his people, let them go. But the Pharaoh refuses. And so God sends these judgments down on the people of Egypt to get their attention, to let them know that they are God. So while they thought they had control of their earth and their land and their people, God was making the point that they did not, that he was in control of the land and the earth and creation, and he was in control of the people. But the Pharaoh, of course, would not listen. So these judgments were poured down on the people of Egypt. But the people of Israel, his people, were protected from these. They were sealed off from these in this land of Goshen. And so the idea here is the world is experiencing these plagues while God's people are protected. There's something distinct here about the judgment on these people. That are not protected by God's seal. Their bodies will begin to rebel. Now, you remember in the trumpets, we didn't get to the people part of this till later in the trumpets, but right from the very first bowl, we're talking about the suffering of people. That when God decides that it's time, people will suffer immediately. The curses of not following God's law, it will hurt. That's just the way judgment works, curses work. There's an effect upon our bodies. People don't understand that when we violate God's will and God's ways, it does break down our bodies. It does create problems in our body. And someday that will become immediately clear. We deny that sometimes. But when God's judgment is full and complete and total, there is no denying it. You will feel the pain of not living in accordance with his will and his ways. And so when we make the exchange and follow the world's passions and the world's desires to fill up on what it calls his pleasure, we will reap the cost of that curse. And someday that curse will be full, complete, and total. That's the first bowl. The second angel poured out his bowl on the sea and turned into blood like that of a dead person, and every living thing in the sea died. I remember this was one of the plagues that we saw in Egypt as well, that the Nile was turned to blood. The Nile was the place of where God, where the people drew their sustenance, drew their nourishment. It was a place of life. It was a place of transportation. It was a core. Well, God turned the whole thing to blood. So that there was no drinking water, there was no commerce, there was just death. Well, the second bowl is talking about the seas, the curse on the seas, that would all turn to blood. Much again like that Egyptian sea, when the Red Sea, when they tried to cross through that and all those people were, it just turned to blood. You can just imagine the horror here. Total, complete. Every living thing in the sea dies. No more fish, no more algae, nothing. Just death. When God decides to judge the sea, it's total and complete. The third angel poured out his bowl on the rivers and springs of water, and they became blood. Again, a reference to the fresh water, an added dimension, all the drinking water, all the rivers, all those things that carried on commerce up and down the Nile, and now the Tigris and Euphrates in Babylon. All these images that come to mind, the fresh waters, yeah, they'll be filled with blood too. And there's an additional statement here with that. Oops. See how that text continues. He says, "You are just in these judgments, O Holy One, you who are and who were. For they have shed the blood of your holy people and your prophets, and you have given them blood to drink as they deserve." And I heard the altar respond, "Yes, Lord God Almighty, true and just are your judgments." See, the idea here is that in John seeing all this persecution of his fellow martyrs and the blood being shed, and there's a justice irony going on here that God says, well, then here's blood to drink. The very blood that they were spilling, they will be caused to own. God will avenge the death of his beloved. He will avenge the death of his martyrs. God has promised to do that. He's putting it off because he wants many to come to Christ. But someday, his vengeance will be unleashed. Those who rebelled against him, opposed him, and they will be forced to drink the blood which they themselves shed. The enemies of God's people, they're destined for this same destruction. That's the idea here. And then we have the fourth angel poured out his bowl on the sun, and the sun was allowed to scorch people with fire. They were seared by the intense heat, and they cursed the name of God who had control over these plagues, but they refused to repent and glorify him. See, we talked about the pouring out of the people, the boils on their body, the destruction of the seas, the destruction of the fresh water, and now this destruction of the heavenly bodies. The idea that God would show his power in the heavens, as he did so often. And he's going to kind of show that no matter how powerful these people think they are, he's in charge of the heavens. And notice that they will have that direct effect of people feeling like they're burning with fire. Again, whether that's literal or symbolic, it's not good. And that's really what we have here. But notice the effect that the result is much like the result of the Egyptian Pharaoh. That when this kind of judgment comes upon these hardened enemies of God's people, you see they curse God rather than turn to him. So we're past the point of repentance here. We're past the point of the good news, the gospel, the invitation. We're past that point. When we get to this part of the pouring out of the bowls, we're at that part where there is no turning back, where God is now sealing people in their stubborn rebellion. So they become just like the Egyptian Pharaoh, whose heart was hardened, and they can't see God before them. They simply die in their own arrogance, die in their own rebellion. That's really the image here. Because they refuse to glorify the God who is, the God who made the sun. So we have then these four bowls poured out, similar to the four trumpets, but these are total and complete and entire. We're now at a different stage of God's judgment. This is an end. This is the last. Everything is destroyed. Then we get to the fifth angel. The fifth angel poured out his bowl on the throne of the beast and its kingdom and was plunged into darkness. And people gnawed their tongues in agony and cursed the God of heaven because of their pains and their sores. But again, they refused to repent of what they had done. So now we're drawing in not just generically the people, it's these beasts and the people that, these governments, these kingdoms, these nations, these peoples that oppress the people of God. The collective judgment. It's not just individuals here and there, but the collective judgment of all that world system, as it will, that opposes the people of God. God holds that place accountable as well. And interestingly, that he turns out the lights on them. these folks who think they have all this power and all this authority and all this wealth, and they can't even keep the lights on. When God decides it's time to turn the lights out, the lights are out. And that's really the God who created the sun, who can send the fire to heat. He can also turn it off whenever he feels like it. He has that kind of control. That's the image. And he's saying when God decides to judge all the power, I mean, we live here in New England, and occasionally the power goes out, and we all kind of panic, except for those of you that have generators. You're happy. You got this figured out. But it's amazing when the electricity goes out, what kind of mess we're in. Or the internet goes out, or our mobile service goes out. What are we supposed to do? We panic. But imagine all the lights go out, like no sun to heat, no sun to light. See, when God decides to withdraw his common grace, if you will, when he decides that the sunlight won't shine anymore, all of a sudden people will realize how small and insignificant they really are. See, we delude ourselves thinking, and we have all this power and all this authority, and we're all these geniuses as human beings. But there will come a time where God points out that we don't have any of that. The only reason we have any of that power is because he continues to turn the lights on. He continues to give the power. And when he decides to stop, we realize how puny and insignificant we are. But you see, these plagues, they have the reverse effect of what during this time, during this age, they're supposed to have. When people see that and recognize they're powerless, they still have time to turn to God. But here we're talking about a judgment that comes down, and you have the same attitude that Pharaoh had, where even with the lights go out, even with all the things gone wrong, still you will not bow down and acknowledge God as God. It's frustrating sometimes, I know, when you see people who just don't get it. There's a hardness in their heart, and this is really what we're talking about. These are people that have decided they do not want to be redeemed. They do not want to participate. They do not want to join in. When they've come to that place of hardness of heart, God says, okay, I'm going to turn the lights out. You don't want any part of me? We'll turn the lights out. And that's really what we have here, is that stubborn refusal. Now again, just as in earlier sessions, when we turn from the fifth bowl into the sixth bowl, that sixth and seventh bowl, it gets more intense, it gets more final. And you would wonder how, with all this intense judgment poured out, these wrath pouring out upon the people of God, you'd wonder how things could get more intense or more final. But listen to these words. The sixth angel poured out his bowl on the great river Euphrates, and its water was dried up to prepare the way for the kings from the east. So this is preparing for the end. All right? Now the image here is the Tigris Euphrates. It's the river on which Babylon was sitting. And what he's saying here is he made this transition in the fifth bowl, and now to talk about the kingdoms and the beasts. We're starting to look towards this destruction of this city. And we said Babylon the Great. Babylon is the representative of all the evil forces that have ever fought on earth against God. That's the symbol. And God is about to teach that enemy a lesson. And so what he does is he dries out this great river Euphrates. Now, just as the Red Sea was dried up so the children of Israel could walk through it, it also has the reverse effect. If the river Euphrates is dried up, now you have a clean path into Babylon. You're not protected around its edges by this river that surrounded it. No, now it's dried up so that the enemies from the east could just come right in, which incidentally is where Persia, the ones that would eventually destroy Babylon, that's where they came from. What he's saying is, I'm going to prepare a way that you think you sit in safety here, you enemy of God's people, but you need to understand there's a bigger, meaner enemy that I'm preparing to wipe you out. There's always a bigger enemy. In this case, the army from the east. That's what we're worried about here. And in fact, that's exactly what happens eventually to Babylon. And we're going to see more of this in the next chapter because God's going to expand this story to tell it in even more detail. But now we see a taste of it here with this sixth bowl. And we see another group of three messengers. We saw the eagle with the three woes, but now we saw the three angels giving out their message from God. But now we see the messengers of impure spirits. We see kind of like the antithesis to these three angels that spoke earlier. Now we're going to see these three impure spirits, which I find humorous. They look like frogs. And it's this idea reminding us again of that plague of frogs, this kind of unclean animal that was prohibited from the life of the people of God, that now they are the very declaration that there's even Egyptian gods that look like frogs. It's the idea that this is enemies speaking, impure spirits. And there's three of them because they came out of the mouth of the dragon, out of the mouth of the beast, and out of the mouth of the false prophet. Now that's that unholy trinity we saw earlier. The dragon, the beast of the sea, and the beast of the earth. That's the unholy trinity. You can hear these croaking frogs coming out of this unholy trinity with their message. They are demonic spirits that perform signs, and they go out to the kings of the whole world to gather them for the battle of the great day of God Almighty. See, there's this deceptive message, this croaking that comes out from these people that are gathering people for the final battle. The lies that are just kind of croaking out there in culture. Just enticing people, triggering people, poking people till they get madder and madder and madder at God. Like we just saw all these people reacting in evil or reacting in bitterness and cursing God. See, that croaking will just go out and just like it happened with Pharaoh, where he was just poked and poked and poked until he turned into this raging, just violent opposition to God. See, God in his sovereignty, if we want to oppose him, he'll continue to push. But what we don't understand is while we're pushing that way, God is still bigger still. God is bigger still. He will push back. And so that's the image here of these frogs that are out there kind of fooling people and deceiving people and croaking this message that you can oppose God and his will and his ways, as if somehow that has a chance. That's really the picture that we see in this little interlude from these 6 bowls. And then we have kind of a pause, this interlude statement, and it actually seems to come more from the words of Jesus himself. Remember, we already talked about Matthew 24. We see that again. It says, "Look, I come like a thief. Blessed is the one who stays awake and remains clothed, so as not to go naked and be shamefully exposed." The idea there is when a thief comes, unexpected. And if he comes at the wrong time, he catches you off guard and you're exposed. You're not going to be prepared. You're going to be seen for what you are. And it's just a reminder to John and the people of God, understand that when this judgment comes, it's not going to be telegraphed. You're not going to be able to figure it out. It's not like you're going to plan for it so that you can get dressed and ready and prepare. No, when then God decides to do this, and the attack comes, stay awake. Stay sober. Don't give up. Don't give in. Don't pretend. Follow God faithfully. That's the idea. If you remember this passage from Matthew 24, Jesus says, "Therefore keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. But understand this, if the owner of the house had known at what time of the night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have left his house to be broken into. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect him." While the world is croaking its lies and telling us and getting us all incited against God, you see, John is hearing a different message and a warning. Don't listen to the croaking. Don't listen to the lies. Don't listen to the false. Don't be caught unawares. God is still coming. And he's going to come like this thief in the night when you don't expect. And then the judgment's going to come. So don't be deceived. That's the interlude statement here. And so after that interlude, then the enemies of God come together. Look at verse 16. Then they gathered the kings together to the place that is in Hebrew called Armageddon. And I have a little note there that literally that's about the mountain Megiddo. It's an actual place. And I think in your notes on the next page, there's a map you can see here where Megiddo is. It's an actual place. The problem is there's no mountain there. It's more of a hill. But the idea is that there's an image here of this battle that's going to take place. And of course, some people, futurists, we've talked about the different theories, futurists believe that this is an actual battle that's going to happen, a World War III, 4, 5, whatever it turns out to be, where all the nations of the world will come together in this particular place and have this battle. That could happen, I suppose. But let's kind of dig a little bit and realize what the image is here. That many significant battles happened there. For example, I give you this passage from Judges chapter 5. Hear these verses. It says, kings came, they fought. The kings of Canaan fought. At Tanakh by the waters of Megiddo, they took no plunder of silver. From the heavens the stars fought. From the courses they fought against Sisera. That was the battle that Deborah fought. Remember Deborah, the female judge. She led the people of God, and she sings that song of victory. And God broke out in that battle and proved the people of God faithful. And the heavens came down and won that battle for them in this very place called Megiddo. And so when John sees this, I'm sure he remembered that story of how God came to rescue from the heavens and delivered this place. This was a place of many famous battles. Look at this text from 2 Kings chapter 23. It says, was Josiah was king. Pharaoh Necho, king of Egypt, went up to the Euphrates River to help the king of Assyria. King Josiah marched out to meet him in battle, but Necho faced him and killed him at Megiddo. And Josiah's servants brought his body in a chariot from Megiddo to Jerusalem and buried him in his own tomb. And the people of the land took Jehoahaz, and son of Josiah, and anointed him and made him king in place of his father. So it's a place of judgment where even Josiah, who was one of the faithful kings, even he received his judgment there for his mistakes. And then this passage from Zechariah chapter 12. On the day the weeping in Jerusalem will be as great as the weeping of Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo. This reminder of judgment again in Megiddo. And so I think what's happening here is this reflection on Old Testament occurrences at this place. God is saying it's going to be that bad. Like when God decides to judge the world. Remember all those judgments that happened in Megiddo? It was not a good day. See, that's what's going to happen to the enemies of God. When they listen to the croaking of the frogs and they rebel in anger against the God who created them, you see, their destiny is already assured. The same thing that happened when God decided to judge in Megiddo, God is going to do the same thing again. That's that great battle that we're talking about. Again, will it be a literal battle? Well, that depends on your view, perhaps. But beyond the literal battle, there is certainly this idea of God's judgment being poured out upon any of the enemies of God. Let's see here. So that's the end of the sixth bowl with his interlude. And now we move to the seventh bowl. And much like we have seen in the early series, when we get to the seventh bowl, we're at a conclusion. And notice how this is spoken here. It says, the seventh angel poured out his bowl into the air, and out of the temple came a loud voice from the throne saying, it is done. It's like the fulfillment of what Jesus declared on the cross when he says, it is finished. In other words, the outcome is already decided. This is now the conclusion of that outcome. We're done. We're in that space where it is completed and it is finished. It's that finality. And we've seen this before with the seals and with the trumpets, where we came to the seventh and we said, we expected more of an end. And in each case, it seems like we're just talking about the completion. We're just marking the fact that God rested. Just like the seventh day of creation, God rested. God is resting when the judgment is poured out. That his desire for a new heaven, a new earth, yes, it means the destruction of the rebellious, but there's a new place. God is finished. The seven seals are finished. The seven trumpets are finished. God is done. But it's a new beginning. It's the beginning of all eternity. The image of this seventh day, then there came flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, and a severe earthquake. No earthquake like it has ever occurred since mankind has been on earth. So tremendous was the quake. The whole idea there is just like, you remember all this lightning and smoke and presence of God on Mount Sinai. God is declaring and revealing himself. And in Daniel, when we talk about the future of God's judgment, he sees this earthquake, this shaking of the earth, this trembling of the earth, that when God shows up to end it all, there'll be no mistaking that God is there, that the end is coming. That we thought the flood was bad. That was the first destruction. It destroyed the earth. But this is going to be so much worse. And when God decides it's over. Again, is this a literal destruction of the earth? Is an asteroid going to crash? Possibly. But what we're seeing here on a larger scale, on a bigger scale, on an eternal scale, is God being clear with all humankind that his plan for the earth is now complete. He will have his holy people in a holy place to worship him forever. And if those who do not wish to participate in that, the judgment is sure and certain. Then we have this statement: the great city split into three parts. The cities of the nations collapsed. God remembered Babylon the Great and gave her the cup filled with the wine of the fury and the wrath. Look, the idea here is that this city of Babylon, this symbol of all the evil of the world, when that earthquake happens, it's split into three parts. And I don't know if the issue there is to kind of discern what are those three parts. I think the point is it's reduced to rubble. It's just destroyed. When it's all said and done, the enemies of God will be destroyed. Whatever greatness they think they've had, it's over. And so the message to all of us from now until then is to submit to the God who is. To not give in to the croaking frogs, and don't give in to the lies, and don't give in to the temptation to live for what the world lives for, to take that mark upon ourselves. No, we are to receive the mark of the Lamb, to follow Christ, to be faithful, not to be fooled by what we see around us and this lack of belief that somehow God will judge things. We stop believing that God will judge. And this vision for John was to say, no, God will judge in his way and in his time. And when it's done, it's done. Don't be on the wrong side of that judgment. Now is the time of repentance. Don't wait until the thief comes. Don't wait until the end. Now is the time. And if we followed Christ, don't give up and don't give in on him. Follow faithfully to the end, because the end is already determined. It is finished. It was finished the day that Christ died on the cross. The end is determined. The judgment of evil is complete. The enemy will be destroyed. But even as he destroys the enemy of sin and the enemy of Satan, he opens up a new way for his people to be found again, to go through and emerge and be part of the Mount of Zion, there with the Lamb, to rejoice and sing our song forevermore. That's the message. That's the hope. That's why we keep moving on. Thanks for listening. Come back next week and we'll continue our study where we will look at a deeper interlude of this Babylon, and God will kind of take a lens on that and show about that final beat. So we'll see you next week for that session 8.